There we go.
Thank you, John. Okay. So now's a good time for me to get started and introduce our speaker, Dr. Ralph Renger. Dr. Renger was a professor at the University of Arizona for 17 years, where he taught graduate level programs on evaluation. He's evaluated numerous local, country, county, and state federal programs, focusing on the development of methods to help transition theory to practice. Ralph, you'll be able to speak to a little bit of your own expertise that you think is most relevant to this particular presentation. But Ralph has just published a book on systems evaluation theory, or SET, that a lot of this talk is going to be derived from, if I understand correctly. And Ralph, if you don't mind saying anything else that you think is particularly relevant and introducing the talk.
No, not really. I mean, just the first part of my career was spent mostly in program evaluation at the U of A, sort of your traditional theory-driven eval. But it was not till I moved to North Dakota, where I was asked to evaluate cardiac systems of care in 7 states, that I started to realize that my own toolkit was inadequate for handling the evaluation of something that was an intervention that was pretty complex, had a lot of moving parts to it, and where people's lives were at stake, right, if there were mistakes made. So that's really where my systems journey started, was just being confronted with a situation that I just didn't feel I had the skill set to be able to handle. And then COVID hit, so I had 2 years of time. So I thought I better try to write the book. And so I wrote the book, and then I've been applying what I wrote in the book set to different situations and different grants when it's appropriate, such as the evaluation of these CTRs. And so I just want to get into the specifics of that today, because we have a very, our group is not only evaluators, but you're content specific. You're around this whole idea of translational research. And so I'm going to hone in on that today during the talk. So we have a couple of objectives today. I'm going to be making the case that the required NIH evaluation plan is not really fit for purpose. And when I say fit for purpose, there's a disconnect, right, between what they're asking and the design of the intervention. So I'm going to be making that argument. And then I want to maybe just share with you why I think, given how the design is for a CTR, why something in systems thinking might be a better approach for evaluating that. So if you walk away today at the end of the day, and it would be a success for me if you're walking away and saying, I wonder if we've got the right evaluation approach, understanding there's certain things we must do, right, for NIH to get the check boxes, but could we even do it a little bit better? And then encourage you, if you feel so inclined, to embark on your systems journey, if you feel like you don't have the tools or the skill set, to encourage you to try to pursue that. So that would be a success for me today. So you're all familiar with the idea, grant, infrastructure, support, translational research. I just need to minimize something here. Get that out of the way here. And if you have any questions while we're going through, you can just come off the mic and ask. That's not a problem. Or you can put it in the chat, and either Eli or Sue can just jump in and ask the question. So, but let's talk a little bit about the CTR design, because that's important to some of the arguments that I want to make today. So this should not be unfamiliar to most of you. It consists of multiple support cores. In the CTR I was working, they may be labeled slightly different, but in the CTR that I was working in, it was the admin core, the biostats, community outreach. Of course, there was the evaluation core and others. But there's also intramural and extramural partners that can be part of that CTR. So this is the basic design, and the required evaluation should, again, be nothing new to any of you, but they require logic models for each core. And they're reporting a lot of outputs, right? Publications, funding, and this kind of thing. So really, the way I see that required evaluation, it really sees these cores as being independent. All right, if you're asking for separate logic models for each core, then the underlying assumption to me is that those cores are more or less independent. And then the process evaluation, or when we're looking at the implementation of the CTR and the cores, then by extension, I would argue that the focus is on how well each core implements its own workflow, because it's being, again, viewed independently. All right, so if we were to just sort of visualize what that might look like, you might, for your administrative core, have a logic model. And then for all the other cores, these are the cores that we had in our CTR, you would also develop logic models for each of those. Again, nothing too earth-shattering, and something that probably all of us have a lot of experience doing. But to me, as I mentioned off the top, there's a disconnect, right, between the stated intervention design, so when you actually read the NOFO, and what the evaluation is asking. I just think there's a disconnect there. So for example, in reading through the latest CTRD NOFO, there were 24 references that referred to dependencies between cores, okay? They didn't see them as independent. The narrative in describing it describes them as dependent. They talk about the collaboration between certain cores. They talk about having to partner with other organizations and promoting multi-directional engagement. Okay, these are all key terms and key words to suggest that these cores need to be interacting with each other in some way. And there's even reference, and I was quite surprised, to some higher order outcome. And I'll talk about what I mean by higher order outcomes in just a minute. But they actually use the language synergize with existing strengths. So there's some key signals here, some key indicators that they might be using some systems language here in their NOFO. Okay, this idea of dependencies, interdependencies between cores, and this idea, which I'll explain in a bit, of maybe something emerging, an emergent property. So in reality, you know, your structure might look something more like this, right? This might be closer to what it actually is. Instead of seeing a bunch of independent cores, these cores are connected in some way to each other. I think this was an initial diagram of our attempt to try to show that. There's some problems with this diagram, which we could delve into, but the basic idea is that, you know, all these cores need to interact with each other in some capacity. One of the limiting things about this diagram is it suggests that all those interactions have to be equal, and they don't. There may be some cores that need to interact more with each other and others less, but there still is the underlying assumption of there's an interdependence between these cores. So if that's true, then I'd suggest to you that the NIH evaluation strategy is missing a couple things, both from the implementation side, so that would be our process evaluation, and from the impact side, the outcome evaluation. So what I would suggest that the strategy is missing, and you may have compensated for, you know, yourself already in your evaluation. You may have already come and realized this and maybe already starting to do some of this. But what it misses is it clearly misses this, right? It's missing all the different interactions and how we would evaluate how those cores work with each other. And of course, this is limited for teaching purposes, but this could extend to all the partners as well that you may have and how they interact with the cores themselves. So, or the center or the admin core, or however those interactions look. But clearly, whatever the different components are of the intervention, the evaluation strategy, although it talks about the necessity in the NOFO of all these components interacting, the evaluation strategy doesn't emphasize anything about evaluating those interactions and those interdependencies. And what it misses from an outcome standpoint or an impact standpoint is it kind of misses this. It misses this idea of, well, what are they all working toward that they can't achieve on their own? What are all these cores trying to achieve, right, that they cannot independently achieve? It's great that we would have outcomes for each of these, and that would be independent, but there's usually a reason why these cores are put together. And there's a reason for that, and they have to work together, and they're trying to achieve something that they can't usually achieve on their own. And I'm going to talk about what that is, that idea of this emergent outcome again in just a little bit. So there's two real major things that are missing from my standpoint, given the design, right? The design is emphasizing dependencies and emergence, and yet the evaluation strategy doesn't talk about any of those things. It talks about evaluating cores using logic models independently. I'm going to stop for just a second and see if there's any questions so far sort of on the background, or if anybody takes exception or doesn't agree with sort of the basic argument there on how I'm seeing, the CTR and its design versus the evaluation strategy.
I'll just chime in that I probably ignored that part then of the NOFO that had asked for separate logic models. We do have separate outcomes or key performance indicators for each of the cores, but we do have one logic model that pulls out functions, I guess. So like the grant making function out of the pilot projects, pilot core and the PD core, and the training function out of the PD core and the bird core, and and looks at those functions and how those functions work together to reach the overall aims of our CTR. And then we do have instrumentation that looks at collaboration and communication between cores. But I did look at outcomes or KPIs by core, but never did create a logic model by core. I probably just ignored that part.
No, but what I'm hearing you describe, Sue, is that, and it's a common practice, right, where we couple or stack logic models together, right, in some way. Is that kind of what you're describing there? And that is a common strategy. I'm going to come to explaining why I think that's a good first step on the path towards this systems thinking, for sure. And you've certainly described, getting at this idea of collaboration. And I want to come back to that in the context of interdependence, because I think a lot of us miss the boat that collaboration is something deeper. And I want to come to, or that interdependence is something deeper than collaboration. And I want to come to that in just a little bit. But certainly what you're exhibiting is already, system thinking ideas already entering into your evaluation, which is really great. I mean, that's where we want to go.
Could I just interject? This is John Stevenson from Rhode Island, seconding what Sue said. We did actually, in our original proposal 7-8 years ago, start with logic models for each of the cores separately, but we very quickly integrated into a single logic model that the tracking and evaluation core uses and has pushed hard to get everybody to think from. However, I think in agreement with you, Dr. Enger, I would say that not all of the other people in our project think about it that way. I think they think about it as separate cores, each with its own key performance indicators, doing its own thing. And that makes it very difficult to talk about emergent outcomes, ways in which all of the cores will produce something together that they could not have produced independently.
Yeah, I think you're right on, John. I think, we came across the same problem. It's like you want to change the culture, right, around this idea of working together as a system. Yet the evaluation tool can undermine that because they're held responsible for individual key performance indicators. So, it's a point well taken. But to me, that really ties back to the culture change. Any other questions or thoughts? It's encouraging to see that some of you have noticed this problem, 8 years ago, a decade ago. What's not encouraging is, and I'm going to come to that, is then why they continue to insist, and they being NIH, continue to insist on individual logic models, despite so many of us understanding and realizing that might not be the correct solution. So I'll come to that in a little bit as well. So if logic models aren't the solution, what might be a better approach? Okay, so the best evaluation, in my opinion, occurs when there's alignment between whatever that intervention design is and the evaluation approach. So that goes back to, this is pretty standard in our field, right? Utility related to the focus on the evaluation design. And that's what I would call, I think what folks are calling and referring to when they use the term something that's fit for purpose, is that the approach aligns with the design. So the logic of our CTR design might be something like this. Again, there's multiple partners, and they're working together to achieve something that, or partners or components can be cores or partners, sorry, and they're working together to achieve something that they cannot do independently. So that's kind of the logic of the design. And when you look at that, you say to yourself, well, then what would be a better approach? And probably something, in my way of thinking, systems thinking has the potential, okay, then to be of use for this kind of an intervention. And systems thinking, let's just not make it overcomplicated. It's just thinking like a system, right? That's not too difficult. But what does it mean to think like a system? And why is that system thinking a good fit? Well, the CTR, for example, has many moving parts, right, that have to coordinate together. And a lot of our studies in systems, that's what systems are. They have a lot of moving parts that are coordinating together in some way. So there seems to be a natural fit between systems thinking and maybe evaluating complex interventions. And so maybe what we know about systems, right, and our understanding of those systems could be applied to evaluating complex interventions. So the rationale is pretty straightforward here. Is we have something with a lot of moving parts. The parts are coordinating. They're trying to maybe achieve something they can't do independently. That sounds like, you know, natural systems in the real world and so forth. And maybe what we know about those systems and those concepts and those properties could be applied to evaluating our interventions. But I will say this, I think the systems approach will only work, right, if the intervention meets what I call the systems test. And the systems test is straightforward, is does it meet the definition of a system? Okay, so it's an integrated whole whose essential properties emerge from the interdependence between its parts. So let's explain that mechanistically in terms of a timepiece. We have all these different cogs in a clock, right? And all those cogs are interdependent on each other. They are all needed, right? And what emerges from them all interacting with each other is the concept of time, to be able to tell time. So if any one of those pieces were removed, right, then the ability to tell time ceases to work. So they are truly interdependent on each other. Russ Akoff, if you ever get a chance, there's a great video from him. It's on YouTube from 1994. It's kind of just explains these whole system concepts and reductionist worldviews and competing from a holistic worldview and all this stuff. But he explains it in very simple and easy to understand terms. And he often uses the automobile as another example to explain this idea of interdependence and emergence. And so there's numerous parts to a car. If you were to take any one of those parts or those subsystems out of the car's not going to work. And if they're all, so they are interdependent, all the parts are interdependent on each other, but to what end? The end is to move you from point A to point B. So that's what emerges, is the ability to, is movement, the ability to move. So the question is, though, that's very mechanistic, but does the CTR pass the system test? And I would argue that I think it does. And when we were about to embark on the evaluation, this is what we did first. And it's, again, going back to the reference of core dependencies, and this higher order outcome suggests to me that it might be a good fit for a systems approach. Now, that doesn't mean, now it's past the system test, that doesn't mean that when you go to evaluate it, right, that you're going to find that it actually operates efficiently or operates like a system. That's part of what our evaluation will show. But what will be helpful in the evaluation, if it passes the system test, is you're now going to direct your attention to different parts that are different aspects of the intervention that are critical for its success, those interdependencies and the emergent outcome. So I would argue that the CTR does pass the system test. It meets that system definition. So what would a better CTR evaluation look like? Well, we have no choice, right? We have to do sort of the NIH required pieces or we don't get funded. So we have to do those. But what we did is we also supplemented that approach. And it sounds like some of you have already gone down that road as well by stacking logic models and so forth. But we did, the first piece, the process evaluation, focused on those interdependencies. We really were looking at the seams or the handoffs or the cracks that can occur between cores and partners. And we evaluated that through stakeholder interviews, and I can get into more detail on how we did that. That was a learning curve on what we tried first and failed, and then what we eventually landed on. And then we have this locus, our levels of collaboration scale, which I want to come to, Sue, because that was one of your questions, which we were using to measure the core collaboration. So that all relates to interdependencies. And then our outcome evaluation, and John alluded to this a little bit, but we were actually looking at, was there a culture change and as an emergent property? And we were looking for indicators in meeting minutes that people were starting to understand that this idea of interdependence, what that meant. So for example, in a meeting, we would listen and we would, in the first year, we would hear nothing about the impact of changing a workflow on another core. And over time, we started to hear every single time somebody was introducing a change that they would bring it to the group to understand how that change is going to influence the other cores and how they do their work. So there was some evidence of a culture change starting to occur. And then we met with leadership to define what we thought might be the emergent property. In our case, we had very novice clinicians engaging in research, and they didn't have that self-confidence necessarily around research. And so we were evaluating whether the emergent property was this idea of researcher self-efficacy. And that's not to say that's the correct one. That's just to say that's the one as a group that, we agreed on. So what's the proof, right? What's the proof that any of this works? And for me, the proof is in what we call the evaluation utility metrics. We published this article. We started this process with the CTR and with our leadership, and ended up publishing an article in the Canadian Journal of Program Eval on this. But what I was always interested in was, is somebody considering the recommendation? Are they adopting the recommendation? And if so, to what level are they incorporating that recommendation? And so I don't know about all of you, but in my 17 years working at the University of Arizona doing more program-related evaluations, sort of your traditional kind of evaluation where you end up with your report, at year end or whenever it is, I don't know. I never really kept track, but my gut tells me less than 10% of our recommendations were probably ever adopted. That would be my gut. We track this here within the CTR, and we had over 81 or 82% of our recommendations adopted within the first 2 weeks. So I think that speaks to the power of the systems evaluation. And you ask, well, what is it that makes it powerful? And I think for me, it's the idea that we're giving information that makes more sense given their operational reality. So I'm giving cores information on their interaction between themselves in the form of a feedback loop, for example. They're seeing that immediately because they recognize that as familiar to their workflows. They also recognize where that's a problem. And then they're like, okay, we can act on this. So one, it has meaning. And number two, I think it's the timeliness of it. And it comes in little chunks. I'll get right to you, John, in just a second. And it comes in little chunks, more in near real-time evaluation. So I don't have 50 recommendations at the end of the year that could maybe be overwhelming. These recommendations are given in little chunks as we become aware of a certain issue around efficiency. We let the leadership know, and then they act on that. John, please.
Yeah, what you're suggesting is really an interesting model for some of these things. One of the mechanisms we use here at Penn is that because the evaluation team probably knows the most about what's going on with our CTSA than anyone except perhaps the program director and the administrative core, we find ourselves providing information each time we meet with a different group, a center or a core. We're saying, oh, you know, so-and-so's doing this too, and wouldn't you think it would make sense to coordinate? And so it's not quite as formal a method as you're suggesting, I think, but it serves the same purpose, and we've found it reasonably effective. And you know, not every suggestion's taken, but a lot of collaborations are made that way.
Yeah, and I don't really care about the mechanism by which it happened. I'm just encouraged that it's happening. And, you know, as the evaluators, we just felt it was our direct responsibility, you know, to try to provide that information. But if through that recommendation, I think where you're getting at a little bit is our idea of how we were looking at how the level of influence of the recommendation. So when it was shared with our leadership, to what extent is it then shared in other contexts with other partners, et cetera, to help them advance as well. So, but again, I'm encouraged, John, that it's actually happening there, and it'd be kind of fun to be able to, it's difficult though in sort of that fluid environment to actually document those kinds of things concretely, isn't it? But nevertheless, it is good to hear that that kind of thing is happening and you're aware of it. But for me, the bottom line in all of this was, it was just so encouraging as an evaluator to finally realize that our work is making a difference. People are listening. But this is something that has to be negotiated beforehand. I mean, this was part of the negotiation with the PI before we started, was like, look, you want us to do this, you want it to be relevant, then, you know, when we provide a recommendation, doesn't matter to me in the end if you adopt it or not. You're privy to other information, the political landscape and everything else. But I do need to know from you within 2 weeks what your choice is, you know, whether you're going to act on this or not. And we usually got that back within 2 days. So it was really encouraging from that standpoint to see the utility of the work that we were doing. So I'll just summarize. I think a little bit of a paradigm shift is needed. I borrowed this slide from the Haynes Center of Strategic Management, so thanks to them. I should have had a screen credit on there for them, but I don't. But I would argue that right now, sort of the way NIH thinks about evaluation is here. It's very analytical. It's very cause and effect. It's reductionist thinking, and we can get into a whole line of a whole nother talk on reductionist thinking and its influence on evaluation and design. But that's kind of where it is in my mind. And, you know, I think we need to get over here. And it sounds like from the discussion, some of you have already made that transition in moving over. And Sue, don't let me forget to talk about this collaboration issue. I want to make sure I bring that up. So, but let me talk a little bit about barriers that I think that are keeping us from seeing, John, what you've been doing for years, but somehow it's not translating into the NOFOs. What are some of those barriers then to that? And I'm just going to highlight a couple. First of all, I think the challenge we have as evaluators is those who have the ear at the federal level are mostly researchers. I would argue that they have a training in reductionist sort of worldview. I myself am one. I came out of an experimental psychology program, so I understand exactly that kind of thinking and that worldview. Not against that worldview, but when those folks also seem to have a little bit of arrogance about them, to be quite frank. And they do not really understand the difference between research and evaluation. And I would argue they see us being evaluators as a weak discipline. And I have always talked about them as the wolf in sheep's clothing. They're there, they're using our name as evaluators. They don't really get the difference. And I mean that sincerely. I've talked to them. They think the gold standard has to be things like the RCT. And they don't understand the difference when you translate and are taking that research and moving it into a program kind of environment or a policy type of environment. And Michael Scriven, who you know has just recently passed away, I attended a great talk by him in Brisbane where he went as far to say is that our field is hijacked by these folks. And I would say that it absolutely is hijacked. And until we as a field can somehow get the ear of those who commission these evaluations, we're going to continue to see this mismatch between what really is designers moving to a holistic view and the evaluations being stuck back in that reductionist sort of mindset. Other barriers, I think we ourselves are a barrier, to be quite honest, in moving this forward. I've been at numerous conferences for 25 years, and I can tell you a lot of us don't understand the difference between evaluation and research ourselves. And we certainly can't explain it to anybody. And not all of us, but a lot of us can't. And we can't explain when a logic model does not make sense. So how can we possibly be an advocate for NIH for change if we can't even understand the conditions and why it's a problem to begin with? We have to be able to do that and explain it to those folks if we want to have a fighting chance of seeing improved evaluation commissions. So let me just go over when the logic model, because I'm not against logic models. I don't want you to walk away thinking I'm not against logic models. I'm not. They make sense under certain conditions, right? When the intervention is simple and there's definitions of simple, like a single component with maybe a linear program theory. And I would argue that all the outcomes are within the direct and immediate control of the intervention to change. That's what I would argue. And so I've done lots of these. We have screening programs are running in here in Arizona that I'm evaluating. And the CDC is big on evidence-based interventions. And the evidence-based intervention can be as simple as a physician being reminded, or a clinician or a physician, being reminded that a patient is due for a cancer screening. I mean, that is an evidence-based intervention that if somehow in that meeting the physician is flagged, they will bring it up, and guess what? An exam will get scheduled. Well, that's a simple linear intervention. And we don't need to over-engineer it, right? It's not rocket science. I'm not saying for that, oh, we should do a systems eval for that. No, the conditions for a simple intervention are there. The logic model is perfect for that. We can lay it out in very simple terms, what it is that this intervention's about and how we would evaluate. But it doesn't make sense under these conditions. If the intervention has multiple components, number one, and the components meet the system test, both those conditions have to be there. The components designed to work together interdependently. And now we can finally get to Sue's question on, or not, it wasn't really your question, but my thought around collaboration. So collaboration, so there's, communication, cooperation, collaboration, right? All these kind of key terms. And to me, we could be collaborating, but not have a shared understanding of what it means to work together interdependently. It's like, yeah, I collaborate with Sue and I collaborate with Eli and John and so forth. But when you really look at it, if we're working together, like each on our, as part of an intervention, each on our own components, am I about to make a change? Am I thinking about, I'm collaborating with you, but am I thinking about how my change is going to influence your workflow, Sue? How it's going to influence your workflow, Eli? How it's going to influence your standard operating procedure, John? Am I really thinking about that? Okay, that's the level that we're talking about when we're talking about interdependence. And if your definition of collaboration includes that, great. But a lot of definitions of collaboration don't include that. They just, yeah, we collaborate, but it's not that deeper understanding of what that means. And then the logic model does not make sense, right, if the components are designed to work together to try to achieve emergence, right? This thing that they cannot do independently. So a little word of caution. Not all interventions with multiple components are intended to operate as a system, right? Systems has become kind of this hot topic. And it's like, well, we need to say we're doing this so we get our funding. So they'll take a bunch of boxes and they'll draw arrows and connect them together and say, look, we have a system. But really, it's just a picture and it's just a bunch of stuff, as Donella Meadows likes to say, or it's just blocks and arrows, as Bob Williams likes to say. And so we have to be sure, right, that, and when we're walking into a situation, we can't assume that we have a shared understanding of what a program is or a system is or the policy is. We actually have to check for ourselves whether those different components were actually designed to operate together as a system. Yeah, go ahead, Sue. You're on mute, Sue.
I guess I want to play devil's advocate a little bit with your previous slide. I guess I would argue that a logic model can show exactly all of those things, that you can have multiple strategies on a graphical logic model, and that they could show how all of those different components work together and interdependently, and how they all come together eventually to achieve certain goals. So I guess I'm not understanding how, like I could see in a simple, like what you had, a simple linear logic model where it's just one thing leads to one thing leads to one thing.
Yeah.
But I guess if you have a graphical logic model with multiple strategies where you have all of these these different strategies working together.
Well, your logic model says they're working together.
Yeah.
Because you've shown each strand. But let me challenge you on a couple of points there. First is, eventually they're going to come together to some kind of long-term outcome, correct?
Or outcomes, yes.
Yeah, or outcomes. All right. I'm going to guess that almost always that long-term outcome probably has some kind of chronological property to it. It may still just be those outputs and everything else. I'm going to guess it's probably not an emergent outcome at all that they're working toward. Now, if they are, good for you. But I've seen countless stacked logic models that are just designed to show coverage of a certain topic area. So there's a lot of underlying conditions related to a problem. And look, this program covers this, this program covers this, this program covers this. That's great. And you can say to yourself, oh yeah, they're all working together, but are they really all working together? And if you're testing that, that's great. Then the logic model could still be an okay way to show that. My guess is that they're not, and that, you know, you have shown all the different strategies that are related to whatever it is. And as an example, let me just get here, this coalition example. All right. So I see this all the time, and I'm not saying that's the case for you. But what I do see all the time is several agencies coming together, each offering programs under a common umbrella, child safety or whatever it is. But they all really just work independently. And they all have their logic model, and they've shown together how they work towards improving the welfare of children. It's like, okay, great. But when you look at it truly, they each are just doing their own thing. And they're not coordinating at all to improve the likelihood of achieving those outcomes that we're talking about. They just really are operating independently under a common umbrella. So I still think you need to look, and if the true intent, as you say, that the intention is there, that the different components are going to work together, that's great, because then I'm just suggesting to you that when you just show a logic model, that doesn't show the connections. I'm glad that you are going deeper and showing and evaluating somehow those connections between those logic models, right? Or showing how they come together towards a common outcome. But, you know, I haven't really, I just think when you start to stack the logic models, you're saying I've got a bunch of independent parts, and do they really, were they ever really intended to work together? I hope so, that's great, but maybe not. So I don't know if that helps answer the question. I mean, what I'm hearing is that, yes, the stacked logic models show how we're all working together towards this endpoint. My question is the endpoint an emergent outcome, would be my first question. And my second question would be, are you then, even though you've stacked those, now thinking about the implementation of those individual programs and looking at how they connect with each other? The answer is yes, good for you. That's really great. I would argue
the intention behind it, and how you're evaluating each of them. Are you evaluating things independently, or are you evaluating them interdependently?
And all I'm suggesting is, yeah, exactly. And all I'm suggesting is the structure that we're putting in place is encouraging the independence and not the dependence between them. That's what I'm suggesting.
I would like to follow up again on what Sue said. I think Sue and I actually think very similarly about this. So for an example, community engagement and outreach is a core that we've started only a couple of years ago, and we're still figuring out how to make it integrate with the pilot core, professional development core, the bird core, because in fact, what community engagement and outreach needs to do is to integrate with those other cores so that the researchers individually get competencies that merge across those things, and the kinds of research they do pull from all of those things. And ultimately, after they've graduated from doing pilot programs, they're building not just individual NIH R01s, but programs of research connecting across other people from other disciplines in ways that pull from all of those cores. So yeah, it's clearly not simple. And I guess the part where I would agree with you, Dr. Renger, is that it's not simple to explain that to the people in the project either.
Right, except that, so we had the same challenge as you're describing with our community outreach core, and the inability to integrate. And the community outreach was then in multiple different ways. It was like, okay, as you're describing, a researcher may want to now work, do some translational research in the field. Where are their connections in the field, and who can they work with to do that? Then we have the whole idea of our practice-based research network, which also should coordinate, you would think, with your community outreach core. All right. So the bottom line in all of this was the evaluation showed in no uncertain terms that had failed. Like, that was a complete failure. And there was no communication. There was no MOUs. There was nothing to indicate that there was a connection between this core and what needs to happen as you described, even in relation to its own core, like you said, the pilot project core. So, you know, and it's probably explains why in the end, they didn't get renewed, right? That's probably a big reason why they didn't. We talked about this beforehand with Sue and Eli on the call. But, you know, this CTR didn't get renewed. And, you know, that's a hard thing as an evaluator to write, right? It's hard to write because your own job's on the line, that, you know, this thing that's supposed to be coordinating and connecting and working in a certain way isn't doing that. And there's no evidence that it's going to. And so, you know, that's a difficult thing to have to put in there. And, but you have to. And so, you know, we did. And that's, you know, not the whole reason, but part of the reason why that didn't get renewed. I'm
interested in how you try to communicate the need for that kind of cross-core and intramural and extramural outreach collaboration to the people within your grant. And how do you have diagrammatic ways of doing that? You have some sort of a way to represent what you mean by a systems approach that you can use to pull people together and understanding why you're trying to evaluate the way you are.
So our experience was the following. When I walked through, and I described this in the book in great detail. So as part of the evaluation process, John, what we need to do is we need to be able to understand, for example, what are the standard operating procedures or the workflows of each core, firstly. And then what I would call the joint standard operating procedures. Where is it that they're intersecting, their workflows intersect, and they need to be connecting with each other. So part of the evaluation process, right, can be something that reinforces the culture, a system's culture. That's what we noticed, is I'm now engaging individual cores first, then bringing them together in a tabletop exercise format to walk through scenarios to understand how they need to adjust their SOPs for each other. And that was so enlightening, because as they started walking through and working together, again, to serve an evaluation purpose, they started to understand why they need to work together in the way that they do. And so our evaluation process, right, reinforced that that systems culture. And I never had a problem with leadership after that in terms of buy-in and understanding what was going on. I mean, it was just as a result of actually having to work through our own processes to get what we need from an evaluation standpoint that helped reinforce that. So was that deliberate up front? No. But it was certainly one of those unanticipated outcomes that was very noticeable after we had walked through that process, because the operating procedures by the end of the tabletop exercise were completely revamped in real time to consider how they interact with other cores. So just as an example of how that unfolded for us.
How did you convince them they needed a tabletop exercise?
Well, I started with just the individual workflows and said, hey, we need to understand whether you're doing what you want, implement what you said you're going to implement. And then it's like, just the next piece was like, hey, you guys interact with each other. We need to know where these efficiencies are. So it wasn't packaged as a systems thing. It was just packaged as an efficiency, a core efficiency thing. And how are we going to become more efficient so that we can be then successful, because the efficiency is a prerequisite to getting the impact that we want. And so that was kind of the argument to get it there. Then the second argument that was helpful in making, and again, I talk about this in the book, but you can't sell people on developing standard operating procedures for evaluation purposes, right? Like, forget it. Now, they're not going to do that, or to detail what they do and how they do it. But if you explain to them that it has some benefit for training purposes, as staff turnover, like what is the job and how do you do it? And it's written down. Now, all of a sudden, they can see other benefit in engaging in the exercise. So that we found was also very helpful in terms of the sell, to get them to move towards wanting to engage in, the individual workshops around developing the standard operating procedures for a core, and then the tabletop for developing the joint standard operating procedures.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Yeah, no, you're more than welcome. Lisa, you had your hand up for a while. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So this is, I'm really getting a lot out of your talk. Thank you so much. I know that we're running out of time. I don't know how many more slides that you want to present, but I'll just put a question out there, which is, I think that in our CTSA, tough CTSI, we're moving towards maybe partial systems. I think that's where we are,
Right.
But we're trying to do something similar to what you're saying in terms of show the interdependence, in terms of achieving the impact we said we were going to achieve. So it's not really process, it's not really outcome, but the impacts, in the first part, we'd say all the wonderful things that the CTSA is going to do and accomplish, right? And, I think in the most recent CTSA FOA, we're really challenged to show impact. So we're trying to do that. So I'm wondering, have you tried to apply this way of thinking about the need to be interdependent in order to have emergent outcomes? Because a lot of what we say we're going to do as a CTSA is really not doable by any one of our cores, right? So I'm wondering if you applied it, and if so, do you have any lessons learned, or what your thoughts are?
No, we absolutely did apply it, and we have multiple publications out on it. on what we did. So, you know, if you just search my name, you'll see those publications on how we evaluated the interdependencies, our how we would try to evaluate and define an emergent outcome, and so forth. So it's all been, we detailed everything, Lisa, on how we did that. And, you know, some of the lessons learned would be probably too long to go into for the little bit of time that we have left now, although I just shared some with John about, you know, that interaction and how we built that culture and so forth. But I would like to just still try to finish a couple of the slides, but I'm also, I want to be respectful of the question. And so I'm also happy to set up another time for us just to meet and discuss if you'd like. Happy to do that. So, but just in the interest of time right now, I'm just going to get through the last few slides if you'll.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you.
So what are the other barriers then? We talked about some of the barriers, right? Is sort of the NIH, who has the ear of the NIH in terms of commissioning these evaluations, and ourselves and what we need to do. But I do think part of the challenge as well is this idea that we don't really have the methods and the approaches in systems thinking. We have a lot of the language. Oh, we got the perspectives and the relationships, and we have all this, you know, these important concepts and boundaries and so forth. But not really any way of applying all that. And so in the absence, what I've noticed when people don't have the tools or they're not available to them, they'll fall back on what they know how to do, which is we'll give them more logic models. And that tends to be where we end up. And again, I think that's the transition point, like I was showing on that diagram before, but I think we can do better and get to like one step further. My friend Louis Atkinson, big systems thinker, talks about getting on your systems journey and stepping outside of your comfort zone. But what I noticed was in terms of the skill set and the tools, when I was confronted with that situation and evaluating those cardiac systems of care, you know, there was nothing out there for me to fall back on. Just loose concepts, loose, vague academic arguments about what complex is versus complicated, but nothing that really said, this is how you can apply these different, apply the idea of system properties and system concepts to actually do an evaluation. So I just set out to do that, to write how we did that. Tested it, as I said, in the emergency management sector, and have been applying it in different areas ever since. So the idea of the book is really to act as that tool for you. And I'm not saying this is the only way to do it or the best way to do it, do it being a systems evaluation, but there was nothing else there and nothing else put out on how to do it. And so, and I am open to criticism. Like, you want to criticize what's in the book, by all means, but I only ask one thing: you show me a better way. And if you show me a better way, that's cool. But if you just want to like trash it for trashing it, I'm not going to listen to you. So, you know, that's kind of my only condition is I put it out there. I would love to see things improve. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what it is, and then we'll leave it, and that'll be sort of the end. I'll just summarize. So I wish I could name it, because systems evaluation theory sounds too academic, but I just kind of like the acronym of SET. So I kind of regret that I labeled it that way, because it does sound a little academic and it doesn't get across this idea of application. Although anybody knows that a theory is only good if it can actually be applied. Consists of 3 simple steps. You know, we don't agree a lot in evaluation on certain things, like what an outcome is or an objective, or, you know, even in the context of this conversation today, I heard a different understanding of what impact versus outcome is, et cetera. And I appreciate that. I think it was Lisa explaining what, you know, her view of what that is. And so I know where she's coming from, but that wasn't my definition of how I would have defined it, for example. And that's okay. But if there's one thing that we can agree on, and it's one of the few things, is that the first step in anything is we have to define the evaluand, the thing we're evaluating, right? Like, that's a common first thing. So we always have agreement on that. And the first step then in this case would be to define, and again, if I could change the language, I would, but to define the complex intervention that meets the system test. right? Like we want to define that. That would be step one. And then step two is to evaluate, and three are aligned to the system properties of that system test. It's just very logical. Step two would be to evaluate the interdependencies, to look for efficiencies in the operation of the intervention. And then step three would be to evaluate the emergence or the effectiveness, right? And step two is a prerequisite for step three, and that's why they're in that order. So there's a very deliberate sequence to the steps. You'll also notice that I took effort to try to place these ideas that float around loosely without any attachment to anything. These concepts of systems levels and scale and boundaries, and we hear people talking about this all the time in evaluation, but there are certain concepts that I found more useful at certain parts of the evaluation. And so I found this idea of scale and boundaries and levels to be really important when we're defining our intervention. And I found these ideas of cascading events and reworks and reflex arcs and feedback loops. By the way, most of this comes out of biology. When I first tried to go down this path, again, when I was in North Dakota working on this cardiac system of care, I hired a biologist to help me understand some of these system concepts. And then as I learned about each one, I just thought about the extent to which they could apply, to evaluating a complex intervention. Again, complex having many moving parts. So all these different things you see listed there are just different ways of actually looking at relationships and interdependencies. They're just different ways to look at that, and they can tune you into seeing the world a little differently. As to how things are related. So I found them very helpful. They don't always all apply, but if you systematically go through them, you can make sure you get a pretty good sense of how one would look at interdependencies. And then, of course, the last step is to evaluate the emergent property. And I just got a paper out on that, accepted in the Evaluation of Journal of Australasia, that should be coming out in the next couple of months, that talks all about this emergent property concept. So that's the rationale. So in summary, I just think the evaluation approach, like SET, doesn't have to be SET, but some systems thinking kind of approach is needed and is better fit for purpose than what the NIH is mandating. And it sounds like some of you have already realized that, and you're already making the transition over to systems thinking, which is wonderful. Again, I'm not anti-logic model, but I just think we need to understand the conditions when they're appropriate. And I'm not about over-engineering an evaluation. If it's a simple, straightforward thing, then let's just evaluate it simple and straightforward. I'm not against the reductionist researchers. I was trained as one. I just think they're in our way when it comes to evaluation, but their worldview is important in understanding how the world works. And I think that these two worldviews, they actually complement each other, right? The holistic and the reductionist, it's not one or the other. When I'm evaluating interdependencies, in whatever intervention I'm looking at, there'll come a point where I realize there's an inefficiency, and I may engage in something like root cause analysis, a very reductionist approach, to try to understand why that inefficiency exists. All right. But my starting point isn't for the evaluation isn't a reductionist place. It's at a holistic place, and then going back down if I need to. Evaluating an emergent outcome is not the same as evaluating a long-term outcome. These are not the same things, okay? And again, just the value added, I think, is just the focus. I've been criticized. They say, well, what you do, Ralph, is nothing different than quality improvement and quality assurance. And I go, yeah, that's good that you realize that that's actually when we evaluate, interdependencies, it's about sort of quality improvement. I'm glad you noticed that. But the point is, it directs your attention to where it's most likely to fail, which are those connections between these component parts. And that's the value added in terms of a quality improvement standpoint. We've been running book clubs that have been really successful. They're no cost to anybody. All you have to do is get the book, but we would organize the book clubs, and they meet 3 or 4 times, and they cover like 3 or 4 chapters each time in the book. And it's a great way, has been proven a great way for folks to network around different issues that they're facing and challenges that they're facing, and share how they try to solve those problems. And so As I said, if you're interested in a book club, you just need to go to the to our website and you can RSVP there. And when we get to critical mass, we'll create another book club. Thought occurred to me that if there was enough critical mass around CTR, CTSA, et cetera, that we might think about actually just doing a book club for this this TIG. So that's just a thought that's out there. But anyway, that's it. Thank you for your great comments today and your insights. I appreciate that. And I was maybe a little more pessimistic when I started, but I'm a little more optimistic that some of you are moving definitely in the right direction. So I appreciate that. Now the question is, how do we convince those in NIH to start paying for more advanced and better systems of eval?
This was great. Are you having any Black Friday sales on your book?
Yeah, I don't know. It's up to what I have been successful at recently, though, is when folks are asking for a talk, I just say, look, instead of paying me, like, why don't you just buy 5 books and send them out to people that couldn't otherwise afford them? Because, you know, you don't make any money. I don't even make $2 on a book. So
Oh, that's not right. Yeah, I want to read more about emergent versus long-term outcomes. I want to read more on that. I really like the model that you showed with systems evaluation and efficiencies versus effectiveness, and see if the book has information on external influences too, and how that's kind of incorporated into the model. So I look forward to reading it.
Oh, well, thanks.
I know we're out of time, but does anybody who has time to stay have any questions? I don't know, Ralph, if you have any time to stay.
I definitely can hang on and answer as many questions as I can.
I have a question for you, Ralph.
No, I'm not doing another talk.
Yeah, well, then in that case, I'm wondering about your thoughts about black boxes, like not necessarily in terms of logic models, but how you in practice identify when a process has a black box that people aren't evaluating, like processes that go into the box and then, hey, presto, people say something else pops out of the other side. But how it works is not actually explained. Do you often run into, or have you run into, black boxes when you're trying to evaluate processes that aren't really discussed or detailed? And what do you do to shine a little light in there?
Well, let me just start by saying I would be shocked if less than 5% of the clients I work with, when I ask for a workflow, have it. Now, in the medical professions, a little bit better for sure, right? Hospital settings and so forth, they'll have those workflows, those standard operating procedures. But most of the programs around social interventions, that when I ask folks, tell me what you do or how you do it, they don't have anything. So the whole thing's a black box. So it requires starting from the beginning to just document everything. In terms of just finding the second challenge, which doesn't really get at your question, because I'm not exactly sure, I guess there is steps that could be missed when we're trying to document that create a black box. But the second thing that we learned, somebody asked about a lesson learned. Do not try to define the system in the first year that you are standing up a CTR. Do not try to define that, because the folks themselves don't really understand what they're supposed to do yet and how to do it. And so that was a big mistake that we made. It's like, well, I don't know, because we've never really tried this before and how we operate and what we do. And so in hindsight, it makes more sense to let folks try to get their own footing, try to figure out how they're working together first as a starting point, and then to jump in and say, okay, let's document in some detail exactly what it is that you're doing, because they have a better understanding of what it is they're doing. And then you go from there. So we actually wasted evaluation resources in the first year trying to document that process that itself was the system was too immature. It was still in its infancy, and it just didn't work. So that was, a lesson learned there. But that's all I could really add in terms of helping answer that question. All right. Well, I hear my little one that just came back, so I'm gonna start to pay some attention to her.
Aw.
And
My
'cause I
little
love
ones
all
are
of
not
you.
so
I
little
love all of you,
anymore.
but I love all of you, but she's more important.
All
Thank you,
right,
Ralph.
well,
right.
everyone, thank you so much, and everyone have a great Thanksgiving
Yes,
and a
happy
safe
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving.
All right. Happy
All
Thanksgiving,
right,
everybody. Eli, I can just hang on for just a second after the call if you
Sure.
like. Okay.
goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
I saw Ingrid here never was able to connect to audio, so I'm going to boot her real quick. All right.
Anyway, I think
That was
you want.
great. That was great.
Is that okay?
That was outstanding.
Okay.
That was
I'm glad you're happy.
that was just enough spice, Ralph. That was real good.
Okay, good. I'm glad. I didn't want to embarrass you.
No, to the contrary.
Okay, good. Now, but you had some other questions that you wanted to ask about, and we said we might want to talk about them after. What was?
I will be super brief. Ralph, what
Yeah.
I'm going to do is put into writing what we're trying to do systems-wise. And I already talked about it with my right hand in doing something that's about 6 months sized. Very
Yep.
good goal. And in fact, a lot of the things that you mentioned in the talk really answered a lot of my questions. So
Okay.
we're going to document by way of proposal, like a 1-page proposal for my leadership, and I will send it to you. You don't have to provide feedback. You're not obligated,
I will.
but I'll put that in front of you for just food of thought, you know.
Okay, good. No, I'm excited. That'll be wonderful. Yeah, I'd love to see. I'd just love to see another leader get involved and push this whole idea just a little bit further, right? So I think if we can get the critical mass, since it's not coming top down, we can get a critical mass from the bottom up. Then if there's like 5, 6, 7 folks that are starting to do this and starting to talk about this, then maybe we'll see the evaluation requirements change, or at least funded to support those additional pieces. So
yeah, agreed. Yeah, without having to like cite a bunch of organizational theorists,
right,
from like the business school or something.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
You're welcome, buddy. Thank you, and I appreciate it. And happy Thanksgiving. Yeah.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you.
Okay, take care.
See you.